Hello guys, today we're going to be doing a video on Rust using the RTX 3060 Ti. We're running a Ryzen 3700X with 32 GB of RAM running at 3200 MHz. Alright, let's jump into the settings. We're going to be starting it off with 1080p on the lowest setting. Alright, we're going to be starting it off with the CPU test, just taking a look at how our CPU is performing and how many cores the game's using up. It seems like it's using up mainly one core, sitting around 60% and jumping up to 75%, and it's 1 to 2 cores it seems like. CPU 2 and 3 are the main ones that are being used up, and CPU 1 occasionally boosts up to 30%, but all the other ones are sitting around 6% up to 10%, so nothing major. Frame rate is sitting at 120, GPU sitting at 45%, so we'll be playing at 240 to 250 FPS without if our GPU was being fully maxed out. Now the game quality looks pretty poor on low settings. This is not recommended for someone using a 3060 Ti at all. The game looks very blurry, and it looks like, yeah, these textures look very blurry. They don't look very detailed at all, so this is not recommended. Look at the shadows. It looks so pixelated. There's also a lot of popping as well, so when you get close to objects they start popping in, and same with the trees. The trees are very bad looking at a distance, but as you get closer to them, that's when the actual real texture shows up. GPU sitting around 70% usage now from 44% like we did with 1080p. So we're still not GPU bound. Frame rate should be the same as 1080p, which it is. We're sitting at 120. Now the one thing that we found out with the 1050 Ti video is that these bushy areas, these foresty areas are definitely the most demanding on the card. A normal area like with roads and stuff isn't going to be as demanding. We don't know how it is during fights and during raids with C4s and explosives going off. That was a pretty decent stutter right there as I turned around. But now GPU sitting around 54% from being in the 40s into the high 30s, going up to the 60s. Wow. Now the game looks much better. That was a big jump in quality, even at 1080p. So you can see, we can actually see the trees that are all around us. Obviously the trees in the distance are still not going to be loaded in properly, but the ones that are up close, we definitely do see the increase in quality. Looking at the grass, they're still kind of low quality, but they're not as bad. Our FPS did take a hit, but that's not really a GPU's fault, since it's still sitting at 50% usage, up to 60%. It could be some CPU band setting like our draw distance or our shadow distance. Those two will be impacting the CPU side of things. And one more thing that could be impacting our performance is the actual map itself. Each area is different, and they will obviously be impacting your FPS in different ways. Some areas will be easier to run, some areas will be harder to run. Here right now we're sitting at 110, so it's still pretty good. We only lost about 10 FPS from here, but yeah. Let's go ahead and push it up to 1440p. So GPU's not fully maxed out, but it's getting pretty close. So looks like if you're playing at 1440p, you want to play at medium settings, and 4K you're pretty much stuck to either very low or low, I would guess. But we do have DLSS also, so I will be testing out DLSS at the end of the video. I would expect DLSS to work really well at 1440p and 4K, and that would allow us to hopefully play the game at high settings instead of being stuck at medium or low. And looking at 1440p, the image quality is just sharper overall, but the overall quality hasn't obviously changed from 1080p. Frame rate is the same, around 110, 120, depending on the area, but we were sitting in the 90s before, the 80s before. So it's a pretty wide FPS range. You could be in the 80s up to the 120s. And if you're playing at 1080p very low, obviously your range is way higher if you got a good enough CPU to be able to support it. The FPS definitely did take a hit from very low to low. I think we're sitting in the 80s from the 70s to the 90s at 4K very low. And now we're sitting in the 60s up to the 70s. Oops, wrong thing. Yeah, playing at 4K, this is insane clarity. It's actually so good looking at 4K, even on low settings. Trees look much better. Playing at very low, I wouldn't recommend it at all. It just looks really bad. But having a balance between medium and low, it's probably the sweet spot for 4K. Obviously, we're going to fall into the 50s like we are right now. So, but what we can do is we can go ahead and enable DLSS. The quality looks very similar or identical to actual native 4K. Frame rate regained 20 to 30 FPS. In this area, we're sitting in the mid 50s to the high 50s, sometimes it's in the 60s as well, I gotta say. And This does feel laggy at times. When you saw that tree pop in, I felt some lag in the mouse movement. The animations obviously looked very smooth, but when I was turning it, I felt a slight lag. Alright, these are our settings for medium settings. Some things were changed, some things were kept the same, but I try to keep them in the middle ground. So my favorite way to play this game right now is definitely on low settings, because medium, the grass looks weird, the trees look weird, kind of. I guess it's personal preference, but for me, low settings looks the best. But what I would do is I would increase the render distance and the shadow distance, because there was really bad pop-in on low settings, and that definitely ruins the immersion. Medium settings, we don't have that issue since I've actually increased it up to a decent level. So all the trees around us, there's no pop-in. It's showing the high-res version of the trees. Maybe all the way at the back there, there's a slight pop-in, but it's not quite as bad. GPU sitting around 60%, depending on the area. Sometimes we do get some dips into the 50s again, but so the issue that we have with 1080p with the grass and the trees is fixed now at 1440p, it looks like. And I mean, there's still some slight issues with the shadows that look very, like, I don't know, looks kind of weird. But overall, the game looks very sharp. Now, playing at 1440p and 4K, you don't really need anti-aliasing. You can still enable them if you want, but since you're playing at a high resolution, you're not going to see too many jagged edges. GPU is sitting around 80% to 90%. We are getting CPU bound in this area, it looks like, since our GPU is going down in usage and FPS is also dropping. So we are being CPU bound by some of our settings, but if you've got a more powerful CPU or a much newer CPU, then this won't be an issue for you. There's no way you're alive. Bye bye. Okay, I gotta eat up and heal up. I need bandages or the syringe. We can just eat, you know, the eating will heal me. What is this thing? XOR switch? That's crazy, that's new. Alright. But yeah, FPS sits around 60 FPS for the most part. Sometimes getting boosted up to 70 and sometimes getting lower into the mid 50s. The only thing to complain about is the FPS, but we can always use DLSS and we're probably getting our FPS back. So let's go ahead and enable DLSS. Looks good still, I gotta say. Maybe it's not as sharp as I once thought, but still looks really good. And we gained 20 FPS, 20 to 30 FPS extra, which is crazy good. So if you're a 4K gamer, then this should be no issue. Just make sure you enable DLSS. Alright, these are our settings. Everything is fully maxed out. Draw distance, you don't really need to have it maxed out because it's too much of a CPU hog. Same with the shadow distance, but if it's really bad, I'll drop it down, but I'll probably be fine. There we go. 1080p max settings. Man, the grass looks really bad. I don't know why. Maybe if I increase the anti-aliasing to TAA. Oh, I disabled it. That makes sense. There we go. That's actually fixed now. Okay. There's a slight blur as well to the screen, but not too noticeable. I'd rather have a slight blur than have really bad looking grass and trees, because it looks so sharp and pixelated that it kind of ruined the immersion. But now it looks so good up close. Looks very, very clean. No jagged edges at all. Same with the distance trees. 1440p is the way to play this game. It looks so sharp, so clean. It's not as demanding as 4K, but you still get a huge jump from 1080p in terms of image clarity and the quality of the game. GPU is sitting around 98%, so it's fully maxed out. FPS is in the 80s, the high 80s into the 90s. Depending on the area, we'll probably fall into the 70s as well if it's a very demanding area, but still very playable. Obviously, there's no lag spikes or anything. The game's running very well. Okay, VRAM is not fully maxed out, it's sitting at 7 gigs. FPS is in the 40s, very laggy now. Some games feel really good at 45 FPS, but Rust is not one of them. The aiming feels very jumpy and very laggy. Feels like there's a delay, like a mouse acceleration feel to it. When you stop turning, it feels like it's still going. And aiming feels way better. So that 67 FPS that we gained from DLSS definitely helped with our aiming. We still do fall into the high 40s, but it's not that bad. Let's go ahead and bring it down to unbalanced. And that should give us 60 FPS hopefully. It does, but we'll definitely fall into the 50s again since we're on the edge of 60. The image quality isn't as good on the grass side, I feel like. Looks very, very blur. Ooh, that was big popping. Alright, Let's go ahead and jump into our DLSS image quality test and then wrap up the video from there. Alright, that's it for the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a like and a subscription, we highly appreciate it. See you next time.